What if a spirit that has been rejected by religion is actually the guardian of one of the greatest secrets of heaven? It seems impossible, doesn't it? But what if I told you that behind many religious condemnations lie hidden spiritual mysteries that have been buried by history? Today's video will take you on a profound and perhaps uncomfortable journey between what the Bible condemns and what ancient traditions reveal. What you're about to hear today may shake your faith or strengthen your spirit. For centuries, many so-called African spirits have been labeled as evil, demonic, or forbidden. But is every spiritual entity rejected by traditional theology truly an enemy of the light? Or are we facing a major distortion, a spiritual and historical error that has been repeated for generations? The spirit we'll reveal in this video isn't just a figure of ancestral worship. He's considered, by many traditions, a true spiritual guide to paradise, a messenger between worlds, an intermediary between the divine and the human. But in Western religious interpretation, he's been condemned as an enemy of God. Why? Because African spirituality, rich, profound, and connected to the invisible, has always challenged the established order. It is not based solely on dogma, but rather on direct spiritual experience, in contact with the mysteries of the universe, the forces of nature, and the celestial guardians who operate in invisible dimensions. However, with the advance of colonization and Eurocentric theology, many of these spirits were quickly transformed into demons. That's right. What was once honored as light was called darkness. What was once a guide became an enemy. What was once paradise became hell. And at the center of this controversy is a specific spirit, a name whispered in African-based religions, a being who, according to oral records and secret traditions, had access to the divine mysteries of the afterlife. For many, he was the guardian of destiny, the link between the soul and the Creator. But for others, a being to be feared. The scriptures condemn him. But what if the condemnation wasn't spiritual, but political? What if this spirit was purposefully erased so that we wouldn't know its true role in creation? What if, in fact, it was always on the side of light, but was presented as the opposite? Have you ever wondered why some books were removed from the Bible? Have you ever reflected on how many cultures and traditions have been silenced in the name of official truth? Perhaps what you're about to hear goes against everything you've been taught, but maybe, just maybe, it's the missing piece in your spiritual puzzle. Today, we're going to reclaim this story. We're going to give voice to what was silenced. We're going to shine a light on a name that was relegated to the shadows. Not to convince you, but to invite you to reflect. Because when it comes to true spirituality, not everything that has been condemned is cursed, and not everything that has been accepted is divine. The truth has been distorted, and today we will restore it. But before we reveal who this spirit is, why he was so persecuted, and what he really represents in the spiritual world, you need to understand the root of this whole controversy. What follows may shock you, but it may also free your mind. Do you believe that a spirit can be unjustly condemned by a religion? Have you ever heard of spiritual guides who have been misinterpreted by traditional theology? Comment below. Your experience, your question, your insight can open other people's eyes too. And this is the space for reflection, debate, and spiritual growth. Now, if this content is already awakening something within you, leave your like, because this is not just a video, it's a spiritual journey. When you like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, you are helping this message reach more people who, like you, feel there is something greater than common religious interpretations. Sign up now if you haven't already, because in the next few minutes we're going to dive into a revelation that could transform the way you view the spiritual world forever. And yes, you need to watch it all the way through, because only by fully understanding the content will you be able to form your own truth, free, lucid, and profound. To understand how an African spirit could be simultaneously condemned by the Bible and seen as a guide to paradise, we need to go back in time, long before religious interpretations dominated the spiritual narrative. In African spiritual tradition, there are entities known as spirit guides, beings who operate between the earthly plane and the divine. These guides are not gods, but they are not human either. They occupy a position of spiritual authority, carrying with them ancestral wisdom, divine protection, and the mission to guide souls on their journey on earth. These spirits in many African cultures are elevated ancestors, messengers of greater deities, or personified cosmic forces. Their names vary, In some denominations, they are called orishas, in others, vodans, loas, and kaisis. But regardless of the name, their spiritual function is clear. They connect the visible with the invisible, the human world with the sacred. They are guardians, protectors, pathfinders, masters of the elements, and above all, representatives of a power that existed long before modern religious structures. However, throughout history, especially during the colonization and forced Christianization of Africa, these spirits were quickly associated with evil. The colonizers, upon coming into contact with a rich, organic spirituality connected to nature and invisible forces, failed to understand it, and more than that, they feared its power. After all, what cannot be controlled is condemned. Thus, what was once a guiding light became labeled a demon. What was wisdom became witchcraft, and what was ancestral became heresy. That was the first mistake, confusing the unknown with the evil. And this is precisely where the central point of today's video comes in. Because the African spirit we are investigating has been placed in this limbo, its essence has been stripped away, its spiritual function erased, and its image completely distorted. In the tradition from which it comes, it is revered, invoked with respect, consulted in times of crisis, and invoked for protection. But in traditional theology, it has been condemned to hell, without the right to a defense. Now you might be wondering, but isn't the Bible clear about prohibiting contact with spirits? Indeed, there are passages that address necromancy, divination, and spiritual practices. In Deuteronomy 18:10-12, for example, there is a direct condemnation of anyone who consults the dead, practices enchantments, or serves as a medium. And therein lies the conflict. The Bible, when read literally, seems to reject any spiritual contact that doesn't come directly from God. But do these passages refer to the same guides venerated in ancient cultures? Or are we applying mistaken interpretations to completely different contexts? It is important to understand that African spirituality does not practice invoking the dead in the pejorative sense that has been attributed to it. What is practiced is communication with the sacred through beings that already exist between worlds. Beings that are not bound by time or space. Beings that, in many cultures, are seen as servants of the Creator God Himself, the one who is above all and everyone. Yes, for many African traditions, including those that have been syncretized with Christianity, these spirits are not rivals of God, but expressions of His will. But how can we explain this to a doctrine that has already determined what is light and what is darkness, with no room for nuance? This is the root of the clash between tradition and religion, a clash that is not only theological but also historical, political, and social. The Bible was shaped by men over centuries with different cultural influences, power interests, and spiritual agendas. Many traditions were simply erased, labeled heresy, and within this context, African spiritual practices, with all their complexity, were labeled simplistically and condemningly. And this created an even bigger problem. Millions of people began to reject their own spiritual roots, believing they were serving God, when in fact they were just reproducing a colonized vision of faith. But what if the Bible, or rather the men who interpreted the Bible, erred in this judgment? What if the spirit that was condemned was actually a servant of light, a divine messenger with a mission to guide lost souls? What if this spirit is precisely what is missing in the understanding of many Christians who feel disconnected from spirituality, even within the religion? Isn't it time to revisit the scriptures with cleaner, less indoctrinated, freer eyes? Christ Himself, on many occasions, contradicted the religious leaders of His time. He spoke to those forbidden, healed on the Sabbath, and forgave what the law declared unforgivable. Jesus did not follow human rules but the will of the Father. And this will often manifest itself in ways the system cannot control. Perhaps if we look closely, we will see that there is much more legitimate spirituality among marginalized peoples and traditions than in the gilded palaces of established religions. By denying the African spirit and all it represents, perhaps we have closed a sacred door, a door that once led to paradise. Because if it is indeed a guide, then to reject it is to reject the very root that leads to the divine. That's why it's so important to reflect deeply on this topic, because it doesn't just concern a spiritual entity, but how we relate to the sacred, the invisible, the eternal. Is our faith based on genuine revelation? Or are we simply repeating inherited convictions without ever questioning them? And what's more, is true spirituality, the kind that transforms, guides, and liberates, really where we've been told it would be? Or is it hidden precisely in what we've been taught to fear? Now I want to hear from you. What we're discussing here is too profound to ignore. Comment below. Do you believe African spiritual guides can be sent by God? Or do you still carry the weight of religious condemnation on this topic? And if you've made it this far, it's because something within you is being awakened. So don't forget to like it. This simple gesture will help this video reach more people like you, who seek real, not just figurative spirituality. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Here we discuss hidden mysteries, hidden truths, biblical revelations, and wisdom that transcends time. Hit the bell, because what follows will take you even deeper into this mystery, and perhaps finally reveal who this African spirit truly was. One condemned by the Bible, but recognized by heaven as a guide. But after all, who is this African spirit who simultaneously carries the weight of religious condemnation and the title of guide to paradise? The name that evokes discomfort in many ears, but also reverence in millions of hearts around the world is Exu. Yes, this is the spirit who, in many Afro-spiritual traditions, is seen as the messenger between worlds, the master of the paths, the one who connects the human with the divine. And precisely because he is the bridge between worlds, he was the first to be demonized by religious interpretations, unprepared to comprehend the depth of his mystery. Exu is not a demon. He never was. This confusion, which persists to this day in many religious minds, is the result of centuries of symbolic manipulation, where everything that didn't fit into the dominant theology was relegated to the shadows. In African traditions of Yoruba origin, Exu is the Orisha of communication, justice, transformation, and spiritual crossroads. He represents the point of choice, the place where the spirit must decide between light and darkness. Therefore, he is present in all rituals, opening the paths to connection with the divine. But it is precisely because he was between worlds, because he moved between extremes, that he was misunderstood. Religious people with little or no familiarity with African spiritual symbolism, when encountering images of Exu, which often feature elements such as skulls, bright colors, tridents, or intensely moving dances, immediately associated him with the figure of the Christian devil. And from there, the error multiplied. Exu was cursed without being heard. He was judged without being understood. He was condemned without anyone truly knowing him. This confusion deepened further with the arrival of Afro-descendant religions in the Americas, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean, where Exu took on new guises, syncretisms, and cultural forms. In Candomblé, he remains the Orisha of path opening. In Umbanda, he often appears in work lines called Exus, spirits who act on the left, overseeing spiritual justice, energetic cleansing, and the protection of spiritual boundaries. But even within these traditions, it is important to separate the essence of the Orisha Exu from the spiritual manifestations called Exus, who have their own journey, their own identity, and should not be confused with evil entities. The point here is to understand that, while in Christianity the devil represents God's opponent, the eternal rebel, the personification of evil, in the African worldview this simplistic duality does not exist. The Orishas, spirits and entities, are cosmic forces with polarities. Yes, but they work for the balance of the universe. Exu, for example, is neither good nor evil. He is just. He delivers exactly what was asked. He teaches firmly. He shows the way, but he doesn't choose for you. And that's why he is so powerful, because he mirrors what's within each of us. But this truth is of no interest to the dominant structure, which prefers a world divided between absolute good and absolute evil. And because Exu carries the truth of the crossroads, the truth that destiny is choice, he becomes dangerous to those who seek control, because someone who thinks for themselves, who converses with the sacred outside of official institutions, who finds power within themselves, and not just in the pulpits, that someone is a threat. And that is why Exu's name was erased from the light and cast into the darkness of collective ignorance. And here comes an honest question. Who benefits from this? Who profits when an entire culture is taught to fear its own spiritual messenger? Who gains strength when a figure of wisdom, who guides and protects, is labeled an enemy. Certainly not the people. Certainly not true faith. The winner is the system that wants to keep the people voiceless, rootless, and without identity. A people who fear their ancestry are easily dominated. A people who reject their guides walk without direction. A people who curse their messengers run the risk of not hearing the divine call when it comes. But Exu doesn't need temples to exist. He lives at the crossroads of the soul. He manifests when you face a life-changing choice, when you pray sincerely, seeking clarity, asking for a sign, an answer, a light. It is Exu who paves the way for the answer to arrive. And this is not idolatry. This is not witchcraft. This is true spirituality. It is connection with the invisible. It is surrender to the flow of life. And the most curious thing, many of the biblical passages that speak of paths, gates, keys, and the opening of spiritual doors refer precisely to the symbolic function of Exu. See, for example, Revelation 3:7. Behold, I set before you an open door which no one can shut. Who is the one who opens doors that no one can shut and closes doors that no one can open? In Christianity, this title is given to Jesus. But in African traditions, the one who opens and closes spiritual paths is Exu. Is it a coincidence? Or are there deeper connections between these figures than we imagine? Of course, we're not saying that Exu is Jesus. They are different symbols, with distinct origins. But what we're proposing here is, isn't the spiritual role of certain messengers being repeated in different cultures, with different names? Doesn't the same spirit of wisdom manifest itself in different ways, according to the needs of each people? And if so, to condemn the other, the different, the strange, is to risk rejecting one's own disguised light. Perhaps it's time to stop asking, is this from God or the devil? And start asking, is this true or manipulated? Because much of what has been labeled satanic was actually just liberating. And here's where it all begins to make sense. Exu as the spiritual guide to paradise. Not because he's the Lord of heaven, but because he opens the paths that lead us there. He's not the destination, but rather the portal, the crossroads between who we are and who we can be. He challenges us to grow, to choose, to evolve. And because of that, perhaps, he's more divine than we dare admit. I know this may all be new to you. It may even be uncomfortable, but discomfort is the beginning of expansion. When something inside you feels strange, it's because it's leaving the prison of ignorance. So now tell me, what do you feel when you hear all this? Does it scare you, intrigue you, or liberate you? Write in the comments below. Now I understand who Exu is. If this content has made you see this spirit in a new light, or say, I need to know more. If something still pulsates within you, yearning for more knowledge, let's continue. And it is precisely here that the weight of the condemnation begins to be felt. Not just a symbolic condemnation, but a theological, textual, institutionalized condemnation. The name of Exu, like that of other spiritual entities revered in ancestral cultures, was thrown into the same cauldron where the fears, prejudices, and ignorance of the religious colonizer were mixed. And what emerged from this cauldron was a completely distorted image, an archetype of evil, a spiritual threat, a symbol to be combated. But where exactly does the Bible condemn entities like him? Where is this doctrinal basis that sustains fear and rejection? Let's look at Scripture. In Deuteronomy 18:10-12 it is written, There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or one who practices divination, or one who interprets omens, or one who practices witchcraft, or one who conjures spells, or one who is a medium, or one who calls up the dead. For all who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. This passage is often used to justify the rejection of any practice involving communication with the spirit world outside the official religious channels. But does it actually apply to the figure of Exu? The first point we need to note is the context. This passage is part of the guidance given to the people of Israel upon entering the Promised Land. The warning was against Canaanite practices involving human sacrifices, destructive idolatry, and spiritual manipulation for selfish ends. This was not a blanket condemnation of any spiritual manifestation outside the temple, but rather a warning against practices that unbalance the people's relationship with the one God, especially when these practices involved abuse, injustice, or cruel rituals. The question that needs to be asked is, Do African rituals involve child sacrifice? Does Exu demand offerings of human blood? Do the spiritual guides of Afro-ancestral traditions fit this model of necromancy condemned by Moses? The answer is clear: no. What we have are traditions that honor ancestors, worship the forces of nature as expressions of the divine, and seek harmony between the visible and invisible worlds. The biblical condemnation, therefore, does not apply directly. It is a historical and cultural framework and must be interpreted responsibly. Another important passage is found in Leviticus 19:31, which reads, "You shall not turn to mediums or mediums. You shall not seek them out, defiling yourselves by them. I am the Lord your God." Once again, the text condemns a specific practice, seeking out the dead for divination, as if it were a spiritual trade, a kind of illicit access to the future. But Exu, as we have seen, is not invoked for this purpose. He is not a necromancer, nor a soothsayer in the pejorative sense. He is a messenger. He is the one who carries the word, who connects worlds, who opens spiritual pathways. He does not replace God. He does not take the place of the Creator. He simply fulfills his function, as any biblical messenger would do. And if we're honest, we'll realize that even in the Bible there are spiritual figures who act as mediators between heaven and earth. Angels, for example. Gabriel, who brings the message to Mary. Michael, who fights in the heavens. And even prophets who received visions and spiritual revelations. Are they all abominable? Of course not. The difference lies in the context, the intention, the source. The problem isn't the spiritual itself, but the use made of it. And on this point, much has been distorted throughout history. It must be stated clearly. The demonization of Exu did not arise from the Bible, but from a misinterpretation of the Bible combined with religious colonization. It was a cultural, not a theological, process, a system of oppression that used religion as a tool to delegitimize everything different, everything African, everything black. Because for the colonizers, admitting that the enslaved people had a legitimate, profound, and powerful spirituality would also mean admitting that they were not inferior, and the system could not allow that. So they used the Bible. They took a few verses out of context. They repeated the narrative that anything different from European Christianity was diabolical. And with that, they created a theology of fear. A theology that still enslaves minds today, even centuries after the end of the slavery of bodies. A theology that teaches us to reject our own ancestors, that prohibits contact with the spirituality of the earth, that transforms symbols of light into images of terror. And most painful of all, this condemnation was so well crafted that many of the descendants of these people began to repeat the discourse of their oppressors without realizing it. Today, there are Christians who pray sincerely, fast, and seek God with all their hearts, but who carry within themselves a deep fear of anything that resembles the spiritual culture of their ancestors, fear of colors, of dances, of rhythms, of names, a fear born not of the spirit, but of colonization. That's why this video is so important, because it's not here to create confusion, but to create liberation, mental liberation, spiritual liberation. The truth, when revealed with love and courage, has the power to heal. And perhaps today, by understanding that Exu is not the devil, but rather a complex spiritual entity with specific functions and profound symbolism, you will begin to reconcile with parts of yourself that were dormant. And what's more, perhaps you will begin to realize how many other biblical interpretations have been distorted throughout history. This is just the beginning. We'll still talk about what this spirit represents in paradise, why it was erased from history, and how reconnecting with it can be the beginning of a new spiritual journey. But now, I want to hear from you. Does this topic resonate with you? Does it bother you or make you reflect? Write in the comments, "I'm beginning to see the truth," if this content brought you clarity. Or write, "Condemnation does not come from God," if you feel you are freeing yourself from fear and reconnecting with your spiritual roots. The truth that many are not prepared to hear is this: the connection between this African spirit and the heavenly realms is not a modern invention nor a distortion of cultures. It is an ancient revelation that spans centuries, crosses oceans, and survives in spiritual whispers kept in toreros, temples, and the hearts of those who have never forgotten where they came from. To say that Exu, this spirit so unjustly condemned, has access to paradise may seem scandalous to some. especially those who have built their entire faith on a rigid religious structure that separates the sacred from the profane with high walls and locked doors. But when we look at African spirituality with unaided eyes, unfiltered by colonization and indoctrination, we begin to see a narrative much deeper than what we've been told. Within Afro-spiritual traditions, Exu is no ordinary spirit. He is the first to be greeted, the last to be dismissed. He is the messenger of the gods, the interpreter of divine will, the guardian of the crossroads between worlds. This means that, spiritually, he is authorized to transit between dimensions. He is not bound to earth, nor limited by a spiritual hierarchy that subjugates him. He walks among humans in the Orishas, between the physical and spiritual worlds, between the beginning and the end. And more than that, he carries our messages to the celestial plane and brings from there the answers we often ask for in prayer, without knowing to whom we are truly speaking. This access to the celestial realms is not interpreted in Afro-Brazilian traditions as rebellion or an invasion of the sacred. On the contrary, it is a sacred function. Exu carries with him the keys to spiritual portals, opening not only material paths, but especially paths of consciousness, paths of revelation, and paths of understanding. And this is where the spiritual scandal begins for religious eyes. How can a spirit so harshly associated with evil have free passage between the realms of light? But this question only makes sense if we're still stuck in the binary view that everything is either heaven or hell, God or devil, right or wrong. Ancestral spirituality doesn't work that way. It understands that there is a balance between opposites, that movement is natural, and that there is no light without shadow, nor wisdom without humility. Exu is not opposed to the light. He is the one who guides us to it. And for this very reason, he is respected as the one who has access to paradise, not as a permanent resident, but as a servant, a mediator, an envoy. Within this spiritual logic, paradise is not just an ethereal place at the end of life. It is a state of consciousness, a high vibrational plane, a realm where truth is complete, where the spirit rests in unity with the Creator. And it is precisely in this transition between human chaos and divine order that Exu acts. He is the one who shows the truth when everything seems confusing. He is the one who holds the mirror before the soul. He is the one who says, "Do you want to get there? Then look within yourself." He is called the Lord of the Crossroads not because he stands in the way, but because he offers the chance to choose. In African spirituality, this spirit carries elements of profound light. Yes, light. He is associated with ancestral wisdom, spiritual intelligence, the cunning that saves, and the logic that protects. It's not the vulgar cunning that deceives, but the intelligence that discerns. Exu doesn't deceive, he reveals. And precisely for this reason, many can't stand his presence. Because he doesn't mask, he doesn't romanticize. He shows the raw, direct, objective truth. And in a society where many prefer to live by religious illusions, being confronted with the truth is almost a personal attack. Furthermore, Exu is justice. Not the vengeful justice of men, but the cosmic justice that rebalances what is out of balance. If you sow, you reap. If you lie, you will be confronted. If you ask, you will have to pay the price of responsibility. Exu is the one who brings the return of actions, not as punishment, but as learning. He shows that every choice has consequences, and that there is no miracle without action. This is spiritual justice in its essence, and it is precisely this kind of justice that sustains paradise. But why was all this hidden? Why was this connection between Exu and the celestial realms erased from the collective spiritual memory? The answer, once again, lies in fear. A spirit that doesn't need temples, that doesn't bow to dogma, that teaches spiritual autonomy, that demands responsibility and not blind worship. This spirit doesn't interest control structures. It liberates, it activates, it confronts, it transforms. And for this reason, it was labeled a threat. Because in a religion based on fear, a spirit that offers choice is seen as an enemy. Except that this truth is returning. It's rising in the hearts of thousands of people who feel something is wrong with the faith they've been given. People who have never truly connected with a religion full of prohibitions, punishments, and condemnations. People who feel there's more, that there's a spirituality that heals, that liberates, that connects with something greater. And for these people, Exu's message begins to make sense. Not as idolatry, not as a replacement for God, but as a bridge, like a key, like a code that frees the soul from the bonds of ignorance. And if Exu has access to the celestial realms, it's not because he usurped that right, but because he was spiritually designated for it. His role is not to dominate, but to serve. It's not to be worshipped, but to be understood. He doesn't want blind worship, but awareness. He doesn't want flattery, but clarity. He wants every human being to know that they are responsible for their own journey, and that no paradise is accessed without first passing through the crossroads of conscious choice. I know this may all be new. It may even go against everything you've been taught. But I also know that if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you is awakening, and awakening hurts. It's like opening your eyes in a dark room after a long time. The light is frightening, but liberating. Now I really want to hear from you. How do you feel hearing this? Does it resonate with truth? Or does it still seem too strange? Right here in the comments. Exu's light also reveals paths. If you felt this message touched something deep within you, or write, I want to know more about the connection to paradise. If it sparked your spiritual curiosity. Now that we understand who this spirit is, how he was unjustly condemned by mainstream theology, and what his deep and little recognized connection to paradise is, the time has come to bring to light what many prefer to keep hidden, the evidence. And we're not just talking about formal historical records, although they exist. We're talking about manifestations, spiritual memories, orally preserved myths, symbols that have resisted attempts at erasure, and that, even disguised in new forms, have continued to live on in faith traditions and rituals around the world. The spirit that many fear today, and that others know as Exu, carries a spiritual heritage recorded in much deeper layers of human history than is usually admitted. Let's begin with the ancient African tradition, where this spiritual guide is revered under different names depending on the people, region, and worldview. What remains, however, is the same spiritual function, the messenger between worlds, the one who opens the paths, who carries the secrets of destiny, and who holds access to divine codes. In ancient Yoruba texts and chants that have passed down through generations, Exu is described as the first to be invoked before any communication with Orun, the spiritual plane. He is, therefore, the official intermediary, the one who holds the seal of permission to transit between the material plane and the higher plane. And here we begin to notice an interesting pattern. In many spiritual traditions around the world, there is always a figure tasked with bridging the gap, carrying messages between the world of men and the world of the gods, between the visible and the invisible. The Greeks, for example, had Hermes, the Egyptians, Thoth, the Romans, Mercury. All these figures are universal archetypes of the messenger, of the one who moves between planes, of the one with wings, rods, keys, staffs, of the one who dominates time and space. And most strikingly, in all these cultures, this figure is not demonized. It is seen as essential, as vital to the maintenance of divine order. But when this same figure appears in African traditions, with black skin, dancing, drumming, and ritual, she is automatically cast into darkness by the Christianized European lens. And it is at this point that historical erasure begins to be unmasked. Because if Exu were truly what religion imposed, an evil, perverse, and deceitful entity, why would he have remained alive in so many millennia-old spiritual records? Why would he still be revered with the same respect by priests and initiates who dedicated their entire lives to the study of the sacred? Beyond oral records and ancient myths, there is also living spiritual evidence, still observable today. These are people who, in moments of trance, embody this spiritual force and clearly manifest what no theological manual has been able to translate: wisdom, sacred irreverence, direct justice, a profound love for balance. What we see in these manifestations is not demonic possession. It is a deep, legitimate, intense spiritual connection. It is living proof that this guide does not present himself to destroy, but to guide. And if we are honest, it is impossible not to compare these manifestations with certain biblical experiences of spiritual ecstasy, where prophets fell into trances, received messages, spoke in tongues, saw angels, or were transported to other dimensions. But perhaps most intriguing of all lies in syncretism. During colonization, especially in Brazil, enslaved people were forbidden from worshiping their gods, guides, and ancestors. To survive spiritually, they learned to hide their beliefs behind Catholic saints. This phenomenon, called religious syncretism, is much more than a disguise. It is a code of resistance, a silent pact with ancestry, and it is within this context that Exu, for example, was associated with figures such as Saint Anthony, Saint Expedito, Saint Michael the Archangel, depending on the lineage, the region, and the era. Now think with me. Saint Michael, according to Christian tradition, is the warrior archangel. He who fights evil, who protects the heavenly portals, who fights the dragon. He is the guardian of heaven. Doesn't that sound familiar? Is it a coincidence that Exu, the guardian of the crossroads, the defender of the paths, the spiritual vigilante, has been syncretized with this same archangel? Or is there a deeper spiritual truth hidden there? Could it be that once again we are faced with the same essence, but with different names, different attire, different cultures? Syncretism is not heresy. It's a code, a way to keep the flame of faith alive amid persecution. And when we observe with spiritual eyes, we see that there is no contradiction. There is continuity. The same spirit that carries the sword of justice can appear as Exu in an Umbanda circle, or as Michael in a Catholic liturgy. The form changes, but the mission is the same: to protect, correct, and guide. And there's yet another figure syncretized with Exu, Saint Anthony, a saint known for being a matchmaker, a jokester, and a powerful intercessor. In Afro-Brazilian traditions, Exu is also seen as the one who oversees love life, relationships, and exchanges. He understands the games of life, affection, and bonds. And so, the connection makes sense. We're not talking about copies. We're talking about spiritual translations, bridges built by living faith, by the survival of the soul, by the wisdom of people who refuse to accept spiritual erasure. And it doesn't stop there. In some more esoteric lines, Exu is compared to the desert serpent that Moses raised to heal the people. Remember that passage? A symbol that seemed cursed but healed, a figure that frightened but saved. Isn't this a powerful parallel to the archetype of Exu? What heals doesn't always come with an angelic appearance. Sometimes the medicine presents itself with force, with a shake, with mocking laughter, with provocation. But still, it is healing. What we urgently need to understand is that the evidence is everywhere. It's in preserved myths. It's in ancestral chants. It's in spiritual syncretisms. It's in the records of real manifestations. It's between the lines of the Bible itself, when read with an open heart and not a steely gaze. The spirit that was condemned may have been the same one who carried the message you so desperately needed to hear, and the one portrayed as a demon. Maybe the same one who held the torch that could lead you out of the darkness. But I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to provoke you, to invite you to investigate for yourself, to question, to feel, to pray, to meditate. Because spirituality doesn't impose itself, it reveals itself. And when it reveals itself, nothing is the same again. Now tell me, have you ever heard of these connections? Did it surprise you? Write in the comments. Syncretism opened my eyes. If this part of the video brought you a new perspective. Or comment, I want to know more about these spiritual bridges. If you felt something profound was ignited inside. And now, we come to the most delicate point, the part of the story that was deliberately hidden. The secret that isn't in textbooks, that isn't mentioned in sermons, that is rarely discussed even in the most profound circles of spiritual study. We're talking about knowledge that has been silenced, not by accident, but out of convenience. A silence that isn't empty, it's strategy. A concealment thought out, calculated, and sustained for centuries. And the inevitable question is, why? Why hide the fact that certain spirits considered dangerous were, in fact, legitimate spiritual guides, authorized by the higher plane? Why transform symbols of wisdom into images of fear? Why erase from the collective memory the living presence of Exu and so many other spiritual guardians of African traditions? The answer is harsh, but it must be stated bluntly. Because spiritual truth liberates, and systems based on domination cannot survive where there is liberation. The religious and colonial manipulation of the image of African spiritual guides was a systematic operation. And to understand it, it is necessary to understand the nature of spiritual power. Since ancient times, those who hold spiritual power have controlled a people's worldview. If you determine what is sacred and what is profane, who is holy and who is damned, who is saved and who is damned, you create a structure where people's souls are held hostage by your doctrine. And that's exactly what happened. During the European colonization process, when millions of Africans were torn from their lands, their families, and their roots and forcibly brought to the Americas, it wasn't just physical slavery that occurred. There was also spiritual slavery, a true spiritual kidnapping. The colonizers knew that as long as there was a connection with guides, ancestors, orishas, rituals, and ancestral faith, there would be resistance, and this resistance needed to be broken. Then came the first attack, demonization, designating as diabolical everything that Black people held sacred, claiming that their drums summoned demons, that their dances were rituals of possession, that their entities were evil, that their gods were idols. And with this, they slowly implanted in the minds of enslaved people the idea that their own spirituality was cursed, that everything that came from Africa was impure, that their beliefs needed to be abandoned so they could be saved. A salvation that did not come from heaven, but from the political and theological expediency of those who dominated. And Exu, as the central figure of this spirituality, was the first to be attacked. As the messenger, the guardian, the communicator between worlds, he represented a direct threat to the colonizers' spiritual domain. So there was no doubt. They immediately associated him with the devil. They chose the symbols that most shocked the European eye: the trident, the red, the black, the laughter, and affixed the stigma of evil to him. They never bothered to understand his role. They simply labeled him, and this label spread like poison through the generations. But that wasn't all. The manipulation went further. They began to rewrite history, teaching theology from a Eurocentric perspective, imposing a single reading of the Bible, where everything that wasn't European, white, and Christian was considered pagan, heretical, and dangerous. And once again, African spiritual guides were cast into the shadows. Their myths, their powers, their names, everything was stifled by centuries of silence, shame, and prohibition. And it is at this point that the phrase becomes truer than ever. History is written by those in power, but spiritual truth endures. And it did. Even under the whip, it endured. Even within the slave quarters, it endured. Even under the imposed cross, it endured. Because spiritual truth does not need theological approval. It lives in bodies, in songs, in visions, in dreams, in healings, in manifestations. It pulsates, and even if they try to extinguish it, it rises again and again and again. Today, when we talk about Exu as a spiritual guide, as the one who has access to paradise, we are not inventing anything. We are simply dusting off a truth that has been hidden. We are shedding light on a secret that many knew but were forced to conceal. And this is disturbing, because those who have always controlled the discourse refuse to accept being confronted with the possibility that the condemned were, in fact, bearers of light. This secret was kept hidden for so long that today it seems strange, controversial, even heretical. But everything true begins this way. Jesus was also called a heretic. Moses was rejected. John the Baptist was discredited. And yet, they were the ones who paved the way. The same is true of Exu. He is the spiritual outsider, the one excluded from the temple, the one who knocks on the door saying, "The truth you seek is beyond what you've been told." And that's exactly why you're here watching this far. Because something inside you knows there's more, that there's an entire universe of wisdom that's been silenced, that perhaps what you felt was true spirituality, but were told to deny, was the calling of this guide who is now being restored before your eyes. He was never the enemy. He was always the messenger, but he was silenced by interests that never had anything to do with God, but with power. This is the secret that has been hidden. Exu's true spiritual function, his connection to the divine plane, his importance as guardian of the paths, and his mission as a revealer of truth. A secret kept silent for centuries, but now beginning to resonate again. And I really want to know, does this make sense to you? Have you ever felt there was something hidden behind what you were taught? Write here in the comments. Spiritual truth resists. If this part of the video touched something deep within you. Or write, I no longer accept the story told by the dominators. If you're willing to dive into this journey of reclaiming true spirituality. When we are faced with the revelation that a spirit like Exu was unjustly condemned, and that his true nature is more linked to light than darkness, we are inevitably led to a bigger question, perhaps the most important of all. What does this reveal to us after all? about the spiritual world? What does this paradigm shift say about everything we've learned so far about the higher planes, about heaven, about God's messengers, and about how the sacred manifests itself? The first answer that pulses in the heart of those who truly open themselves to this kind of knowledge is, the spiritual world is much more diverse, alive and dynamic than traditional theology has taught us. There is no single model. There is no single path. There is no single form of connection. The spiritual plane is not a headquarters full of obedient soldiers marching in a straight line. It is a living vibrational field, in constant movement, composed of diverse frequencies, entities, missions, languages, and forms of divine expression. When we look at the different cultures, religions, and spiritual systems spread across the world, from north to south, from east to west, we realize that all, without exception, have spiritual figures that bridge the visible and invisible planes. Some cultures call them orishas, others angels, others daemons, others saints, others guides, ascended masters, spirits of light. The names change, the symbols change, the form changes, but the spiritual function remains the same. Beings who walk between worlds, carrying messages, protecting, guiding, and balancing energies. Exu, in this broader perspective, fits in as one of these universal manifestations of the spiritual messenger archetype. And what's most fascinating is realizing that the symbolic descriptions of Exu, as the one who carries keys, who opens doors, who moves between planes, who speaks all languages, who understands all intentions, are extremely similar to the attributions given to certain angels and archangels in biblical scriptures. A powerful example is the archangel Gabriel himself, who appears in the Bible as a celestial messenger. He announced the arrival of the Messiah, who delivered visions, who revealed spiritual secrets. Gabriel speaks for God, but speaks to humanity. He translates the heavens for our understanding. And this is exactly what Exu does in Afro-spiritual traditions. He translates the divine into the human world. He is not the author of the message. He is the channel. He decodes, communicates, carries. He deals with the codes of hidden reality and delivers them in the form of signs, paths, experiences, encounters. And perhaps this is precisely why he is so misunderstood, because he reveals what many want to keep hidden, because he shows that the spiritual world is not the property of a religion, but a field open to consciousness. Furthermore, there is Archangel Michael, the one who guards the portals, who wars against evil, who protects the children of the light. Have you ever stopped to think that this role is almost identical to that of Exu in Afro-Brazilian spirituality? Exu is the guardian of the paths, the one who protects against spiritual attacks, who prevents negative energies from entering where they were not intended, who demands respect and justice in spiritual pacts. The difference is that while Michael is portrayed with a sword and celestial armor, Exu appears with a cape, trident, and a loud laugh. One is seen as a hero, the other as a villain. But is this difference real or merely cultural? And if we delve even deeper, we'll see that this diversity of the spiritual plane is so rich that it completely escapes rational comprehension. There are entities that present themselves as intense light, others as symbolic figures, others as ordinary people. There are guides who come from ancestry, others who connect with natural forces, others who identify with familiar images from the collective unconscious. What matters is not the form, it's the vibration. What matters is not the appearance, it's the spiritual mission. The spiritual world doesn't operate with the same aesthetic judgments we use here. What's beautiful to one culture may be frightening to another. What's sacred to one people may be misinterpreted by another. And precisely for this reason, judging the spiritual realm solely through the filters of Western religion is a mistake that distances us from the truth. Because truth isn't found in one place. It's scattered across cultures like pieces of a grand spiritual puzzle, and each people carries a part of this whole. Exu is the piece that was forcibly removed from the board for centuries, and now, when replaced, he reveals a pattern that was incomplete, a pattern that tells us communication with the divine is broader than you imagine, that the paths of spirituality are multiple, that God's messengers don't follow a single appearance, a single language, a single culture. They emerge according to the needs of each people. They manifest themselves in a language you understand. And sometimes, yes, The angel that protects you may not have wings. He may have bare feet, a sarcastic laugh, and a vibrant red cape. The diversity of the spiritual plane is, in fact, one of the greatest proofs of divine intelligence, because the Creator doesn't speak to just one people. He speaks to everyone. He reveals himself in leaves, in stones, in the winds, in prophets, in dreams, in symbols, and whoever restricts this revelation to a single system is trying to limit the unlimited. And it is precisely this kind of limitation that so many spiritual guides came into the world to break. Perhaps this is why guides, messengers, and protectors appear in so many cultures, because human beings, everywhere in the world, at any time, have always known they are not alone, that there is something or someone on the other side of the veil, walking alongside, guiding, protecting. This knowledge is ancestral, it is spiritual, it is true, and to deny this is to deny the very essence of life. And now that you've heard all this, how does the spiritual world feel now? More vast? More colorful? More accessible? Or does it still scare you that the sacred can appear in forms you didn't expect? Write in the comments below. I recognize the diversity of the spiritual world. If this content made you see beyond traditional religious structures, or comment, messengers come in many forms. If you realize that perhaps spirituality has always spoken to you, just in ways you previously didn't know how to interpret. We've reached the part that most chills those who insist on keeping their faith locked in a box of unquestionable truths. Because when we begin to understand that the spiritual world is diverse, and that figures like Exu, so misunderstood, have legitimate and elevated roles in the dynamics of the divine plan, an inevitable question arises. Why isn't this in the Bible? Why in the 21st century do most Christians still completely ignore these broader dimensions of spirituality? The answer is uncomfortable, but it can no longer be ignored. The Bible, as we know it today, is not the complete portrait of spiritual revelation. It is a fragment, a collection of texts that have undergone selection, censorship, and manipulation over the centuries. And yes, many writings were deliberately deleted. Did you know that there are books considered inspired by various ancient spiritual traditions, but which were removed from the most popular versions of the Bible? These are called apocryphal or deuterocanonical books, depending on your theological perspective. Books that reveal deeper layers of spirituality, that expand on the narrative of angels, the heavens, and intermediary spiritual beings, but which, for some reason, were considered too dangerous for the general reader. And among these books is one of the most fascinating and most hidden of all, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is a spiritual key. In it, we find vivid accounts of fallen angels, entities that walked among men, celestial watchers, the structure of the heavens, and even interdimensional journeys. Enoch didn't just receive visions, he was taken. He walked among the angels. He saw what few have seen. He understood codes that are only revealed to those who transcend religion and enter into direct spiritual experience. And most strikingly, in his visions, he describes beings who, in their spiritual function, closely resemble the guides and messengers of African traditions, beings who connect worlds, beings who maintain balance, beings who carry the responsibility to protect, correct, and reveal. These beings aren't named Exu, obviously. The name is cultural, but the essence, the function, the energy, it's there, and that changes everything. Because if the Book of Enoch had been kept as part of the official scriptures, perhaps today there wouldn't be so much prejudice against spiritual figures who walk between planes. Perhaps today Exu would be recognized not as a demon, but as a watcher, as a guardian, as a sacred observer. But Enoch was excluded, his message silenced, his vision discarded. And once again, spiritual truth was shaped by the interests of those who wanted to control the narrative. Another excluded and rarely cited book is the Book of Jubilees. It expands on the Genesis accounts, offering details about creation, angels, and the spiritual forces that inhabit the earth. It speaks of spiritual covenants, heavenly instructions delivered by divine messengers, and supernatural interventions. And all of this was left out. Why? Because these texts reveal that the spiritual world is infinitely more complex and inhabited than the churches want to admit. Texts that open the mind, that challenge dogma, that force the reader to leave their comfort zone. And there are other, lesser-known but equally impactful writings: the Apocalypse of Elijah, the Psalms of Solomon, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, all of which mention spiritual beings who act as channels, intermediaries, and guardians. All contain revelations that bring the biblical vision closer to the African spiritual framework than to Western theological rigidity. And here it's worth some deep reflection. If these texts speak of realities so closely aligned with what is now rejected and condemned by traditional religions, could the problem lie in the content or in the fear of losing control over people's faith? Because think about it. If the faithful begin to understand that there are legitimate spiritual guides outside the clerical structure, that there are beings of light who don't fit the European model of holiness, that there are ancient paths of spiritual connection as deep as, or even deeper than, those taught in temples, then perhaps people will stop relying so much on human mediation. Perhaps they will stop needing external spiritual authorities and begin to search within themselves. And that's frightening. It's frightening for those who have always profited from fear. It's frightening for those who have always controlled through guilt. It's frightening for those who have always needed you to believe you are unworthy, incapable, impure. But the hidden, forgotten, and banned texts, they live on. In ancient manuscripts, in oral traditions, in personal revelations, in spiritual lines that survived the force of colonization and continue to transmit wisdom that cannot be erased. And the more you open yourself to these contents, the more you realize that the mystery has always been present. It's just been camouflaged. The Bible is a sacred book, yes, but it's not the only sacred book. It's a door. It's not the whole house. And if you truly want to grow spiritually, you need to have the courage to open doors that have been closed, not by God, but by men. Doors that hide answers to questions you've carried since childhood. Doors that explain why you've always felt there was something wrong with rejecting what your heart recognized as true. And perhaps one of those doors is being opened right now, at this very moment, as you listen to these words and feel a mixture of shock, relief, and liberation within you. Because something is making sense, something you couldn't name, but you've always sensed. And that's what these books reveal. The Spirit moves where it wills. Truth is not the exclusive property of any group. And the revelation isn't over. It continues. Now tell me, have you ever heard of the Book of Enoch? Did you know it was excluded? Did this make you rethink what else might have been hidden? Write in the comments below. I want to read the hidden books, if you feel ready to go further. Or comment, the Bible didn't tell everything. If you understand that there are pieces of the spiritual puzzle still waiting to be discovered by you.